Mommy, can we get the blue cupcakes with the stars after you're done? Leo's whisper was a tiny, hopeful spark against the oppressive opulence of the grand ballroom. I adjusted his clip-on tie, my heart aching at how small he looked in his Sunday best. Yes, Peanut. I promise. Just 3 more speeches, I whispered back, pressing a kiss to his forehead. As a freelance translator, I had spent the last 6 months scraping together every cent from late-night corporate gigs just to keep our tiny apartment and pay for his inhalers. Tonight was supposed to be my biggest payday yet. A high-stakes tech gala where the elite rubbed elbows and spoke in whispers I was paid to decode. I never thought a glass of champagne and a wrong turn into a VIP suite would be the reason I'd stop breathing in front of my son. The air in the service corridor suddenly turned frigid. I had stepped behind a heavy velvet curtain to adjust Leo's shoe when the voices drifted through the vents, cold, clinical, and discussing the permanent removal of a whistleblower. My blood turned to ice. I tried to pull Leo back, to vanish into the shadows, but my heel clicked against the marble. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. "Who's there?" A voice sliced through the air like a jagged blade. I didn't wait. I scooped Leo up and ran, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We burst through the heavy exit doors into the concrete silence of the parking garage, the echoes of our footsteps chasing us. But they were faster. 2 men in tactical gear emerged from between the rows of luxury SUVs, their faces twisted into masks of professional lethality. "Tyrone. Please, not in front of the boy," I gasped, the name of the lead security head tripping off my tongue. I backed away until my spine hit the cold metal of my beat-up sedan. "You heard too much, Maya," he hissed, his eyes intense and focused only on me. Before I could scream for help, his hand was around my throat, the pressure immediate and terrifying. I clawed at his fingers, the world starting to blur at the edges as I struggled for a single scrap of oxygen. Leo dropped to his knees on the oil-stained concrete, his little hands clasped together as if he were praying. "Please don't hurt Mommy. Please stop." Then, I saw him. A man standing near a concrete pillar maybe 15 feet away. He was tall, dressed in a sleek black suit that seemed to swallow the dim garage light. While the world around me was a chaos of violence, he was a pillar of absolute, terrifying silence. He didn't rush. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, he began removing a heavy silver ring from his right hand, his eyes cold and calculating. He moved so fast I barely saw it, a glitch in the darkness. 1 second he was a shadow, and the next, his hand was a vice gripping the attacker's wrist. "Let her go." His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the concrete seem to tremble. It was the kind of authority you didn't argue with, the voice of a man who had already decided how this would end. With a sharp, practiced twist, he forced the attacker to release my throat, stepping forward to deliver a clean, devastating blow that sent the man crashing to the floor like a bag of cement. I collapsed, drawing in a jagged, burning breath as Leo threw himself into my arms. The stranger stood over the fallen men, adjusting his cuff as if nothing had happened. He looked down at me, his expression softening by a mere fraction. "Your father was a good man, Maya," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in my sea of panic. "I'm here to settle his debt. Now get in the car." The champagne bubbles in Maya's glass had long since gone flat, mirrors of the stale air inside the VIP suite. To the investors, she was little more than a high-end piece of hardware, a living, breathing translation app in a floor-length silk gown. She stood slightly behind the lead financier, her voice a low, steady murmur as she smoothed the jagged edges of their aggressive Mandarin into polite, corporate English. Then the tone shifted. It wasn't a word she was asked to translate that caught her attention, but a sharp, hushed exchange between 2 men lingering near the heavy velvet curtains. They weren't looking at the city skyline, they were looking at the guest list. "The liability has become too expensive," the shorter man whispered in a dialect from the southern provinces, one he clearly assumed Maya wouldn't recognize. "The board wants a clean break. Eliminate the liability before the morning session." Maya's breath hitched, a microscopic tremor in her composure that she prayed they hadn't seen. She forced her face to remain a mask of professional boredom, continuing to translate a boring anecdote about interest rates for her current client. But her heart was suddenly a hammer against her ribs. She knew who the liability was. She had seen the files they'd left unattended on the mahogany sideboard earlier that evening. She began to calculate her exit. If she could just reach the double doors, she could vanish into the main ballroom's sea of sequins and tuxedos. "Is something wrong, Miss Lin?" The voice was like ice water down her spine. The shorter man had turned. He wasn't looking at the financier anymore. He was looking directly at her. His eyes narrowed with a sudden, sharp realization that her silence wasn't ignorance. It was comprehension. I believe I left my tablet in the foyer," Maya stammered, her voice an octave higher than usual. "I'll be right back." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked, not ran, not yet, toward the exit. The moment the heavy doors thudded shut behind her, she abandoned the pretense. She didn't head for the ballroom. They would expect that. Instead, she ducked into a narrow service alcove, the smell of industrial cleaner and discarded hors d'oeuvres replacing the scent of expensive cologne. "Hey! Stop her!" The shout echoed behind her, followed by the heavy rhythm of footsteps on the polished floor. Maya bolted. She tore through the service corridors, her heels clicking like gunfire against the linoleum. She didn't have time for the elevators. They were too slow, too easy to trap. She hit the heavy crash bar of the stairwell door, her silk dress snagging on the metal and tearing with a sickening sound. She flew down the stairs, 3 flights, 4, her lungs burning. The door to the parking garage was heavy, but she threw her entire weight against it, bursting into the subterranean chill. The garage was a forest of concrete pillars and shadows, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and damp stone. Her car was 50 yards away. She fumbled in her clutch for her keys, her fingers slick with sweat. Click, click. The lights of her sedan flashed, a beacon of hope in the gloom. She was 10 feet away when a black SUV swerved around the corner, its tires screeching as it cut off a path. She skidded to a halt, turning to run back the way she came, only to see the 2 men from the suite stepping through the stairwell door. Maya backed away, her heels catching on the uneven pavement until she felt the cold, hard metal of her own car door against her shoulder blades. She was boxed in. The silence of the garage was deafening, broken only by the ticking of a cooling engine and the steady, predatory approach of footsteps. The shorter man adjusted his cufflinks, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You have a very impressive ear for languages, Maya," he said, his English perfect and terrifyingly calm. "It's a shame you didn't learn when to stop listening." The short man's hand reached out, fingers hooked like a bird of prey, aiming for the delicate line of Maya's throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact of cold skin and the rough pull of gravity, her breath hitching in a silent, desperate plea. The impact never came. Instead, a dull, sickening thud echoed through the concrete cavern of the garage. Maya's eyes snapped open to see a blur of charcoal wool and motion. A man had stepped from the darkness of the structural pillars, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that made the hitmen look like amateurs. Before the lead attacker could even register the intrusion, he was folded backward. A palm strike to the chin snapped his head up, followed by a swift, calculated kick to the knee that sent him crashing to the oil-stained floor. The second man lunged, reaching for a weapon concealed beneath his blazer, but the stranger was faster. He caught the man's wrist, the snap of bone distinct and sharp in the quiet air, and redirected his momentum into the side of the SUV with a bone-jarring metallic crash. It was over in seconds. No wasted movement. No cinematic posturing. Just the cold, clinical application of violence. The stranger stood over the groaning figures, his chest barely rising with the effort. He was tall, clad in a tailored overcoat that seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent light of the garage. When he turned toward Maya, the shadows retreated from a face defined by hard angles and eyes that looked as though they had seen the end of the world and survived it. Maya pressed harder against her car, her fingers digging into the cold metal of the roof. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How do you know who I am?" The man didn't move toward her, yet his presence seemed to fill the entire space between them. He didn't offer a reassuring smile or a frantic explanation. He simply watched her for a beat, his gaze lingering on the torn hem of her silk gown before meeting her eyes with a heavy, solemn intensity. "Your father was a good man, Maya," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of a long-held secret. He knew this day would come, even if he hoped it wouldn't. Maya's heart skipped. Her father had been a quiet man, a scholar of linguistics who had died years ago in what she had always been told was a tragic accident. To hear his name spoken here, in the blood-scented silence of a parking garage by a man who moved like a shadow, felt like a bridge collapsing beneath her feet. "My father," she breathed, the world tilting on its axis. "What does he have to do with?" "There isn't time for the why or the how," he interrupted, his tone shifting from solemn to commanding. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, Maya thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he produced a heavy, matte black key fob. Behind him, a sleek, obsidian-colored armored sedan purred to life, its hidden headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. "The others will be here in less than 3 minutes, he said, stepping aside to clear the path to the passenger door. He didn't ask for her trust. He didn't even offer his hand. He simply stood there, an immovable force against the encroaching tide of the night. "Get in the car, Maya." The authority in his voice left no room for hesitation. Maya looked at the two men unconscious on the floor, then back at the stranger who seemed to know the ghosts of her past. She took a single shaky breath, abandoned her own vehicle, and moved toward the open door of the black sedan. The tires of the black sedan whispered against the private asphalt as they ascended the winding, lightless road. Maya sat in the back, her fingers laced tightly with Leo's. Her brother was uncharacteristically silent, his face pressed against the tinted glass, watching the city of glass and steel shrink into a cluster of distant, flickering jewels. Beside them, Cashin Thorne was a silhouette of absolute stillness, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. They reached the summit where a monolith of glass and reinforced concrete loomed against the jagged tree-line. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress disguised as a masterpiece of modern architecture. As they approached, a series of hidden infrared sensors tracked their movement, and a massive steel gate slid open with a mechanical hiss that felt like the closing of a tomb. "Out," Cashin commanded, the engine cutting to a dead, heavy silence. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of cold marble and sharp angles. Hidden recessed lighting flickered on as they crossed the threshold, revealing a space that felt more like a command center than a home. High-resolution monitors recessed into the walls displayed live feeds from the perimeter, thermal sweeps of the woods they had just bypassed and encrypted data streams that Maya couldn't begin to decipher. "You can't keep us here," Maya said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She turned to face Cashin, her defensive posture a sharp contrast to her torn silk gown. "I don't know who you are, and I certainly don't know why you're dragging my father's name into this. He was a translator at the university. He liked gardening and old jazz. He wasn't, whatever this is." Cashin didn't answer immediately. He walked to a sleek console in the center of the room and tapped a sequence into the glass surface. A holographic display shimmered into existence between them, a digital archive of faded photographs and redacted military dossiers. "Your father was a master of 6 dialects and a ghost in the field," Cashin said, his voice devoid of sentiment. He pointed to a grainy image of a much younger man in tactical gear, standing in a desert landscape Maya didn't recognize. The eyes were unmistakable. They were her father's eyes, but filled with a hardness she had never seen. He wasn't just a translator, Maya. He was the primary intercept officer for an elite intelligence unit. He spent 20 years dismantling the very organizations that are currently hunting you. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at Leo, who looked just as pale as she felt. The ordinary man who had taught her how to bake bread and helped her with her Latin homework was a stranger. "He left that life to protect you," Cashin continued, stepping closer. The lethal efficiency she had witnessed in the garage was still there, simmering just beneath his polished exterior. He knew that if the syndicate ever realized he hadn't burned his files, they would come for his legacy. That's you. And that's the boy. Maya looked around the high-tech sanctuary, the cold realization sinking in. Her father hadn't just died in an accident. He had been hiding in plain sight, and now the veil had been torn away. She looked at Cashin, a man who seemed to be a living extension of her father's secret world. He was cold, dangerous, and perhaps the only thing standing between her family and the shadows. "Why you?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. "Why did he trust you?" Cashin's expression didn't soften, but for a fleeting second, the tension in his jaw tightened. "Because he was the one who pulled me out of the dirt when I had nothing left. I owe him a debt that doesn't end just because he's gone." He turned back to the monitors, his focus already shifting back to the perimeter. "Get some rest. The guest wing is biometric locked. You're safe here for now, but the world you thought you lived in is over." The silence of the guest wing was broken not by a voice, but by the soft, rhythmic pulse of a crimson light on the wall console. Maya stood frozen as Cashin tapped a command, and a wall-mounted screen flickered to life. It wasn't a movie or a data stream. It was a live news feed from the city. The shaky camera of a bystander captured a hellish orange glow against the night sky. Maya's breath caught in a jagged sob. She recognized the charred remains of the wrought iron balcony and the blackened brickwork of the third floor. It was her apartment. The place where Leo's height was marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe, where her father's leather-bound dictionaries sat on the shelf, and where her favorite silk robe hung behind the door. In an instant, the incendiary flash of a firebomb had turned her history into ash. "They didn't find you," Cashin said, his voice devoid of pity but grounded in a stark, grounding reality. "So they erased the trail." Maya turned away from the screen, her knees trembling. She looked at Leo, who had fallen into a fitful sleep on the oversized suede sofa, his small chest rising and falling in the only rhythm of normalcy left in her world. Everything else, her clothes, her photos, the physical remnants of her identity, was gone. She was a ghost in a borrowed gown, standing in a fortress built of steel and secrets. Cashin stepped into her line of sight, blocking the image of the fire. He didn't offer a hand to hold or a hollow word of comfort. Instead, he held out two objects that caught the light of the sterile room. A smartphone with a matte titanium casing and a slim, dangerously thin encrypted laptop. "Crying won't bring the walls back," he said, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. "In this world, sentiment is a luxury you can no longer afford. Your apartment was a target because it was static. It was a place where you could be found." He placed the devices on the glass coffee table between them. "These are your new life." The phone uses a rolling encryption protocol that bounces off 3 different satellite arrays every 60 seconds. "The laptop is hardwired into my private server. From this moment on, you don't exist on the public grid. No social media, no banking on open networks, no calls to friends." Maya looked at the devices, feeling a cold shiver of resentment mixed with a terrifying dependency. "You're stripping away everything that makes me human." "I'm giving you the only currency that matters," Cashin countered, his gaze unwavering. "Information. The syndicate knows where you lived, but they don't know what you know. They don't know about the files your father left behind, and they don't know that I'm the one holding the door shut." He leaned in, his shadow stretching across the marble floor. "They think they've silenced the liability. We're going to show them that the liability is the only thing they should have feared." Maya reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the laptop. The weight of it felt like a weapon. She looked up at Cashin, seeing for the first time that his coldness wasn't a lack of feeling, but a suit of armor, one he was now forcing her to wear. She realized then that her ordinary life hadn't just ended. It had been a beautiful lie, and the fire in the city was the only truth she had left. She took the phone, the screen glowing white against her palm, and felt the first spark of a cold, quiet rage beginning to replace her grief. The amber glow of a single desk lamp was the only light in the vast command center, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floor. Maya had found him there, staring not at a monitor of live data, but at a small, weathered coin, a military challenge gale, turning it over and over in his scarred palm. "Why are you really doing this?" Maya's voice was a soft intrusion into the stillness. "The high-tech fortress, the bodyguards, the way you looked at my apartment on the news. It's more than a favor for an old colleague." Cashin didn't look up, but the rhythmic metallic clink of the coin stopped. He set it down on the glass surface with a finality that echoed. "A decade ago, I was a ghost in a Black Ops unit that didn't officially exist," he began, his voice dropping into a register so low it felt like a vibration in the floorboards. "We were compromised in a valley outside Kandahar. My team was gone. I was bleeding out in the dirt, waiting for the final sweep to finish me off." He finally turned to her, and for the first time, the cold professionalism in his eyes cracked, revealing a raw, jagged history. "Your father wasn't supposed to be there. He was a translator attached to a nearby diplomatic convoy. But when the distress signal went out, everyone else stayed back. The risk was too high. The politics were too messy." Cashin stood up, his silhouette dwarfing the light. He didn't care about the politics. He stole a transport and drove into a live fire zone. He dragged me 3 miles through the brush while the syndicate's predecessors were literally breathing down our necks. He took a bullet in the shoulder meant for my head. Maya pressed a hand to her mouth. She remembered that year, the hiking accident her father had come home with, the way he'd limped for months and laughed it off as a clumsy fall. "He never told me," she whispered. "He wouldn't," Cashin said, a grim shadow of a smile touching his lips. "He wanted you to grow up in a world where men didn't have to do things like that. But he knew the debt remained. When he realized his health was failing a few years ago, he contacted me. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a shadow. He asked me to be the wall between you and the people who would eventually come to collect on his secrets." He walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. The air between them hummed with the weight of the truth. This wasn't a hero's rescue or a stranger's kindness. It was a transaction of blood, a life for a life, governed by a rigid, unbreakable code that Maya was only beginning to understand. "I've watched you for years, Maya," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "I was at your graduation. I was in the hospital parking lot the night Leo was born. Not because I wanted to be, but because I had to be. I am not a good man, and I don't do this out of pity. I do it because without your father, I am nothing but a name on a cenotaph. This isn't charity. This is a debt in blood, and I intend to pay it in full." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Cashin wasn't just her protector. He was her father's final, most lethal legacy. The coldness she had mistaken for indifference was actually a terrifyingly focused devotion. Maya looked at the man before her, lethal, lonely, and bound by an ancient sense of honor, and felt the last of her skepticism wither away. She wasn't just a liability to him. She was the living proof that her father's greatest sacrifice had meant something. The high-tech silence of the estate was usually broken only by the hum of cooling fans or the distant chime of a perimeter sensor. But as the morning sun hit the glass walls of the central hub, a new sound drifted through the corridors, the high, inquisitive voice of a 7-year-old boy. Leo was sitting cross-legged on a floor of polished obsidian, his eyes wide as he tracked a series of glowing blue schematics floating on a holographic display. Cashin sat beside him, his massive frame hunched slightly to meet the boy's eye level. There was no condescension in his posture, only the patient, focused intensity of a master craftsman passing on a trade. "The trick isn't just seeing the camera, Leo," Cashin said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant rumble that had once terrified Maya. Now, it sounded like a steady anchor. "It's understanding what the camera wants to see. If you know the blind spot, you own the room." Leo nodded solemnly, his small fingers mimicking the swiping motion Cashin used to rotate the 3D map of the estate. "Like a magic trick?" "Better than magic," Cashin replied, a rare, microscopic softening appearing at the corners of his mouth. "It's logic. Logic keeps you safe." Maya watched them from the shadows of the upper gallery, her hand resting on the cold steel railing. She had spent a lifetime protecting Leo from the world's sharp edges, keeping him wrapped in a blanket of ordinary that had turned out to be a lace veil. Seeing him now, learning the alphabet of surveillance and the grammar of security from a man who lived in the dark, felt like a betrayal of her father's peaceful lies. And yet, it felt like the only honest thing left. She remembered Uncle Bang, her father's oldest friend who used to bring Leo wooden puzzles and tell him stories of invisible dragons. She realized now that Bang had likely been another ghost from the military past, another guardian in the shadows. But where Bang had been warmth and laughter, Cashin was steel and precision. And somehow, Leo was gravitating toward that strength with an instinctive, heartbreaking trust. Cashin stood up and handed Leo a small, silver device, a localized signal jammer disguised as a toy. If the red light stays steady, it means you've successfully masked the frequency. Try it on the kitchen drone. Leo scrambled to his feet, a look of pure, focused determination on his face. He didn't look like a victim of a firebombing anymore. He looked like a recruit. As he ran toward the kitchen, his sneakers squeaking on the marble, Cashin remained still, watching the boy go with a look that Maya finally recognized. It wasn't just professional duty. It was a fierce, quiet protectiveness that mirrored her own. Cashin turned his head slightly, as if sensing her presence in the gallery. He didn't look up, but his shoulders shifted. "He's a quick study," he said, his voice carrying easily through the open space. "He has his grandfather's mind for patterns." Maya walked down the stairs, her silk gown rustling like a long-forgotten ghost. She stopped a few feet away from him, the space between them no longer a chasm of fear, but a bridge of shared necessity. The scary stranger, who had neutralized hitmen with brutal efficiency, was now the man teaching her son how to survive. "You're making him like you," Maya said softly. "I'm making him a hard target," Cashin corrected, finally turning to face her. His eyes were unreadable, but the lethal edge seemed tucked away, replaced by a weary sort of gravity. "In this life, being soft is a death sentence. I can't change what happened to your apartment, Maya. But I can make sure he never feels that helpless again." Maya looked at the spot where Leo had been sitting, then back at Cashin. The walls she had built around her heart, the ones made of resentment, suspicion, and grief, felt remarkably thin. For the first time since the gala, the coldness of the estate didn't feel like a prison. It felt like home. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Cashin gave a short, sharp nod, already turning back to the monitors. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." The deep, pressurized silence of the guest wing was shattered by the sharp, persistent chime of Maya's new phone. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the fortress usually felt most impenetrable, cloaked in the artificial peace of high-end encryption. She reached for the device, her heart already accelerating before her thumb even touched the screen. There was no text. No caller ID. Only a video file, 3 seconds long. Maya pressed play, and the breath died in her throat. The footage was grainy, filtered through the ghostly green of infrared, but the subject was unmistakable. It was her. She was lying in the very bed she currently occupied, her hair spilled across the white pillowcase, her chest rising and if the rhythmic peace of sleep. The angle was from the external security camera mounted just outside her reinforced window, a camera that was supposed to be her shield. The video looped, a digital taunt that whispered, "We can see you. Even here." A shadow darkened the doorway before she could scream. Cashin stood there, his frame silhouetted by the dim hallway lights. He didn't ask what was wrong. He was already holding a tablet that mirrored her screen. "They've breached the external relay," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had changed. The measured, robotic calm that had defined him since the parking garage was gone. In its place was something vibrating and jagged, a low-frequency hum of impending violence. Maya scrambled back against the headboard, the phone slipping from her hands. "How? You said this place was a fortress. You said we were safe." Cashin didn't answer. He walked to the window, his eyes scanning the tree line with a predatory focus that made Maya's skin crawl. He wasn't looking for a breach anymore. He was hunting for a scent. The realization that they had turned his own tools against him, that they had dared to look at the woman he was bloodsworn to protect, had snapped something inside him. The rigid code of honor hadn't just been challenged, it had been desecrated. They didn't just hack a camera, Cashin murmured, his voice sounding like grinding stones. They sent a message. They think this is a game of reach. He turned back to her, and for a split second, Maya saw the man her father had pulled from the dirt in Kandahar. His eyes were no longer those of a protector. They were the eyes of a killer who had found his target. The sophisticated, tailored strategist was gone, replaced by a terrifying predator who had been poked through the bars of his cage. "Stay in the panic room with Leo," he commanded. He was already pulling a heavy, matte black tactical vest over his shirt, his movements blurring with practiced speed. "Seal the biometric lock. Do not open it for anyone but me. Not even if you hear my voice on the intercom." "Where are you going?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to clean up the trail," he said, checking the slide on a suppressed handgun with a metallic clack that sounded final. "They wanted to see what's inside these walls. Now I'm going to show them what happens when I leave them." He didn't wait for her to protest. He moved through the suite like a phantom, his presence vanishing into the darkened halls of the estate. Moments later, the heavy thrum of a high-performance engine echoed through the garage below, a low growl that faded into the distance. Maya stood alone in the center of the room, the glowing screen of the laptop still showing the infrared ghost of her own sleeping face. The fortress felt colder now, less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, and for the first time, she wasn't sure which was more frightening, the villains who were watching her, or the man who had gone out into the night to erase them. The high-rise penthouse of the syndicate's headquarters was a cathedral of glass, overlooking a city that had no idea it was being bled dry. Marcus Sterling, the CEO whose name had been a whispered threat in Maya's nightmares, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosted against the skyline. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who bought and sold worlds over morning espresso. The heavy mahogany doors didn't swing open, they were detonated inward. Cashin Thorne entered first, a blur of tactical precision and controlled fury. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't need to. The two guards at the door were neutralized with a clinical efficiency that left them gasping on the plush carpet before they could draw their weapons. But this time, Cashin didn't take center stage. He stepped aside, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife, his eyes fixed on Sterling like a hawk circling its prey. Maya walked into the room, her silhouette sharp against the debris. She wasn't wearing a torn gala dress anymore. She wore dark denim and a structured jacket, her hair pulled back, her eyes as cold as the marble beneath her feet. In her hand, she held the encrypted laptop, the digital heart of her father's legacy. "You've been very busy, Marcus," Maya said, her voice steady, devoid of the tremors that had defined her in the parking garage. Sterling turned, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Miss Lin, I see you found a new dog to leash. Do you really think a few bruises and a break-in will stop a billion-dollar merger? Information is power, and I own the stream." "You did," Maya countered. She set the laptop on his obsidian desk and turned the screen toward him. A progress bar was flickering, nearing 99%. But information is only power when you control the flow. I've spent the last 3 hours routed through your own secure servers. Every offshore account, every recorded bribe, every eliminated liability memo. It's all here. Sterling's smirk faltered as he saw the file names scrolling by. Names of ships, shell companies, and men who had disappeared. You wouldn't. You'll destroy yourself in the process. The legal fallout. "I'm not taking you to court, Marcus," Maya interrupted, stepping closer until she was within his personal space. She felt Cashin shift behind her, a silent promise of violence if Sterling so much as flinched. A courtroom is a place for people who still believe in the system. "I'm taking you to the public." She tapped the final key. "Upload complete." "At this moment," she continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that data is hitting every major news outlet, every regulatory board, and every rival board member you've stepped on to get here. You aren't being arrested. You're being erased." Sterling lunged, his face contorting into a mask of desperate rage, but he froze halfway. The cold muzzle of Cashin's sidearm was pressed firmly against the base of his skull. The silence in the room became absolute, thick with the smell of ozone and the weight of a fallen empire. "Touch her," Cashin rumbled, the sound vibrating with a dark primal promise, "and I stop being a man of honor." Maya didn't flinch. She looked Sterling in the eye, seeing the terror finally take root in his gaze. She realized then that she wasn't the victim fleeing through a parking garage anymore. She was the daughter of a ghost, the ward of a shadow, and a force in her own right. "My father died to keep this world away from me," she said, leaning in. "But he gave me the tools to end it. Consider the debt paid." She turned her back on him, a gesture of supreme confidence, and walked toward the shattered doors. Cashin followed a step behind, his eyes never leaving the defeated man at the desk. As they stepped into the hallway, the sound of sirens began to rise from the streets below, a low, mechanical wail signaling the end of an era. The elevator doors closed, sealing them in a momentary, pressurized peace. Maya looked at her reflection in the polished steel. She was tired, she was grieving, but for the first time in her life, she was truly unafraid. The dust from the fallout had finally settled, leaving a silence over the estate that no longer felt like a bated breath. In the weeks following Sterling's public implosion, the headlines had shifted, the sirens had faded, and the wolves that had hunted Maya's family were now pacing behind steel bars. Maya stood on the glass balcony of the central hub, watching Leo. Her son was in the garden below, throwing a ball for a sleek, dark-furred Belgian Malinois that Cashin had introduced to the grounds. Leo's laughter was bright and unburdened, a sound that seemed to scrub the lingering scent of smoke from the air. "He's adjusting well," a voice rumbled from the shadows of the doorway. Cashin stepped forward, but he didn't look like the predator Maya had first met in the parking garage. The tactical gear had been replaced by a sharp, charcoal-gray suit, and the jagged edge of his intensity had smoothed into something more permanent and protective. He held a thick, cream-colored envelope in his hand. "The past is officially dead, Maya," he said, holding the envelope out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the heavy grain of the paper. Inside were 2 passports, the ink fresh, the holograms shimmering. They bore new names, a new lineage, and a history that was scrubbed clean of syndicate shadows and liabilities. Beneath the documents lay a series of financial statements for a trust fund, the number substantial enough to ensure that Leo would never have to worry about the cost of a dream. "I didn't ask for this, Cashin," Maya whispered, looking up at him. "The debt was paid the night you walked into that penthouse." "This isn't about the debt," Cashin countered, his gaze steady. "This is about sovereignty. Your father fought for a world where you could choose who you wanted to be. I'm just giving you the keys to the gate." He leaned against the railing, looking out at the horizon where the city's lights were beginning to flicker on. "But a new name is just a label. You need a purpose that matches the woman I saw in Sterling's office." He pulled a second, smaller document from his pocket and laid it on the railing between them. It was a formal contract, but the title at the top made Maya's heart skip. Head of Communications, Thorn Global Security. "My firm deals in secrets and protection," Cashin said. "But we lack a voice that understands the human cost of this world. You have your father's gift for languages and a backbone made of tempered steel. I don't want a ghost or a ward, Maya. I want a partner." Maya looked at the contract, then back at the man who had transitioned from a nightmare to a guardian, and finally, to something she couldn't yet name. He wasn't offering her a hiding place. He was offering her a seat at the table. He was giving her the power to ensure that what happened to her family would never happen to another. She looked down at Leo, who was currently trying to teach the dog how to mask a frequency, using a tennis ball. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first one that didn't feel heavy with the weight of the past. "Head of Communications," she mused, her fingers brushing the signature line. "I imagine the benefits package includes a very high-end encrypted laptop." A ghost of a smirk crossed Cashin's face, the closest he ever got to a laugh. "Only the best. And a security detail that never sleeps." Maya picked up the pen he offered. She didn't hesitate. With a few swift strokes, she signed away the last of her fear and stepped into a future she had built with her own hands. She wasn't a victim, a liability, or a secret anymore. She was Maya, newly named, fiercely protected, and finally, truly free. The city below was a tapestry of amber and indigo, the distant hum of traffic reduced to a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of a world finally at peace. On the high balcony of the estate, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the expensive, ozone-crisp tang of the fortress's filtration system. Maya leaned against the stone balustrade, her new silver-cased phone resting in her pocket, a tool now, rather than a lifeline. She felt the heavy, silent presence of Cashin before she heard him. He didn't move like a man trying to be stealthy. He simply existed in the spaces between shadows, a permanent fixture of the architecture he had built to defy the world. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on the railing. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at her, his profile a series of hard, uncompromising angles against the moon's pale light. "The trust is active," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the very air around them. "Leo's future is anchored. Your office at the firm is being digitized by morning. There are no more loose ends, Maya. No more ghosts." Maya turned to face him, the silk of her sleeve brushing against his wool coat. "The debt is paid, then. You've done everything my father asked for. More than he could have ever dreamed." Cashin went silent. It was a heavy, deliberate pause that stretched between them, filled with the unspoken history of the last few weeks. The gunfire in the garage, the fire in the city, and the quiet mornings watching Leo learn to be brave. "The debt ended the moment Sterling was taken into custody," Cashin said, his voice shifting, losing its clinical edge. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a velvet box or a piece of jewelry. He produced a small, ancient iron key, the original key to the estate's inner sanctum. He placed it in her palm, his fingers lingering against hers. The heat of his skin was a stark contrast to the cold metal. "I'm not a man of traditional promises, Maya," he continued, his gaze locking onto hers with a searing, absolute intensity. "I have no rings to offer, no hollow vows of a life I don't know how to live. But I am a man of territory. And I am telling you now that this territory is yours." He stepped closer, closing the gap until the air between them was thick with the magnetic pull of a decade's worth of watching and waiting. "I have spent 10 years guarding a legacy because I owed a dead man a life," he whispered, his hand rising to trace the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly light for a man who knew only how to break things. "But I don't want to guard a ghost anymore. I want to stand beside the woman who broke Marcus Sterling with a keystroke. The debt is gone, but I have no intention of ever letting you go. Not unless you ask me to." Maya looked down at the iron key in her hand, then up at the man who had become her shadow, her shield, and finally her partner. She realized in that moment that her father hadn't just sent her a bodyguard. He had sent her a mirror. Someone who understood that the world was dangerous, but that the only way to survive it was to find something worth fighting for. She wasn't safe because of the biometric locks, the thermal cameras, or the reinforced concrete of the hill. She was safe because the predator standing in front of her had chosen to turn his back to the world and face her. "I'm not going anywhere, Cashin," she said, her voice small but unbreakable. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the lapel of his coat, pulling him just an inch closer. The fortress behind them was silent, the city below was indifferent, but for the first time in her life, Maya felt the profound, unshakable weight of belonging. The hunt was over. The shadow had found its light. The elevator doors slid open with a pressurized hiss, revealing the nerve center of Thorn Global Security. It was a space of brushed steel and glass, bathed in the cool blue glow of monitors that tracked global threats in real time. Analysts moved with a quiet, disciplined urgency, but as Maya stepped onto the floor, the frantic clicking of keyboards momentarily softened. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored the architecture of the room, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder like a quiver of arrows. Beside her, Cashin was a silent, immovable force, his presence commanding a path through the open-plan office without him saying a single word. "The morning brief is in the Situation Room," Cashin murmured, his hand hovering just inches from the small of her back, a phantom touch of protection that had become their private shorthand. They stepped into a glass-walled chamber where a dozen of the firm's top operatives stood at attention. On the central digital table, a map of the Caspian region flickered, overlaid with supply chain routes and encrypted communication nodes. "This is Maya Lin," Cashin announced, his voice cutting through the hum of the room with the finality of a gavel. "She is the head of communications. Her word on narrative, external optics, and high-level negotiation carries my full authority. If she asks for a data dump, you give it to her. If she flags a protocol, you change it." One of the senior analysts, a man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow, looked up from his tablet. "With all due respect, sir, we've always handled our own internal reports. Why the sudden shift to a civilian oversight?" Maya didn't wait for Cashin to defend her. She stepped forward, her hands resting flat on the digital table, her eyes scanning the data points with a clinical precision she had inherited from her father. "Because your internal reports are why Marcus Sterling was able to hide his trail for 5 years, Maya said, her voice calm and terrifyingly clear. "You're experts at the how of security, but you've forgotten the why. You see numbers. I see the stories those numbers are trying to hide. From now on, every operation passes through my desk to ensure the why doesn't turn into a liability." The room went silent. The analyst held her gaze for a beat, seeing not a civilian, but the woman who had dismantled a CEO's empire from a parking garage. He gave a sharp, respectful nod and returned to his screen. Cashin didn't smile, it wasn't in his nature, but the tension in his shoulders eased. He leaned in toward her as the briefing resumed, his voice a private rumble meant only for her ears. "You're a natural," he whispered. "I had a very demanding teacher," Maya replied, her fingers dancing across the console to pull up the next set of files. For the first time, she wasn't translating for someone else's power. She was defining her own. The Ghost's daughter and the Shadow's protector were no longer hiding from the world. They were rewriting it, one encrypted line at a time.